Hello and welcome to this session. I'm very proud to be moderating this because this is one of my greatest idols. Nick Broomfield is an icon, I would say, in documentary filmmaking. People like, as it says in the program, people like Morgan Spurlock and Louis Theroux and Michael Moore are standing on your shoulders. Wow. I know you hate when people say stuff like that because you're a very humble person, but either way, it's true. So welcome very much. Let's give Nick a hand while people are still coming in.
Well, it's fantastic to be here, and I'd like to try and be as helpful as possible to you. So I don't really know what. I hope we're going to include the audience with questions and stuff at some point.
Yes.
Welcome. Hello. Nice to see you.
When we were discussing on the phone what we were going to talk about, I suggested that we talk about the ethics of staging documentaries, because this has been a big discussion in Denmark. And you said, well, this is almost a non-filmmaker's discussion. So today we will be having a filmmaker's discussion, even though this is a TV festival.
Frank's very naughty because I said I think a conversation on ethics is really boring. So of course it's the first, we decided of course not to talk about it. So wonderfully being Frank, it's the first thing we do talk about. I think the point I was trying to make was I remember when I was at film school, we got into all these ethical questions about what you should or shouldn't do in documentary. And I just remember it being something that really put people off making films. It was kind of like a conversation between academics. It was actually all the tutors at the film school who couldn't actually make films, who were kind of like the film historians and the film archivists and so on, who started this debate. And my theory was it was actually because they didn't know how to make a film. So it was much easier to talk about the ethics of filmmaking. But it really, I think it inhibited people because people were so worried that they might be doing something wrong that they were actually worried about going out to make a film. So I've always felt it's very much down to whether at the end of the day you feel the thing you've made is representative and truthful of the subject that you've done, whether it's honest, whether it's something you can live with. My test is if I get kind of itchy when I'm watching a screening of one of my films and desperately need to go to the toilet, I know that there's something wrong with the film just there, and I shouldn't have done that. And I think that's the kind of test that I would like to apply to filmmaking, really, rather than having these. Because I think, journalists too can discount a lot of films. They say, oh, well, you've recreated this and you've recreated that. And then there's a big debate about what the film didn't do right rather than what the film's about. And it's kind of a way of blocking out information. So we can now move on. Now we've done our ethics conversation.
You have made a lot of films about characters who didn't want to be in your film. This has become kind of your trademark in a way. How did that come along? Is that something that you have gone for, or is it by coincidence?
Well, I think traditionally documentaries have made films about people who have agreed to be interviewed. And documentaries are typically made in a very organized way, and you have a researcher, and the researcher contacts people, and they line up the interviews, and then you drive around and you interview the people. But of course, a lot of the people who you really want to talk to, who are people who are powerful or might have done things that aren't correct, don't necessarily want to be filmed. And I think you can't just accept that those are people that are off the radar, that you can't get to. And you need to find a different way of telling that story. I always think people reveal more about themselves by the things that they won't talk about or that they don't want to talk about than the things they will talk about. So, I suppose in the process of making the films that I've made, I've tried to evolve different ways, sometimes of making a film about somebody who's never actually in the film, but still coming up with a very, what I believe to be an accurate portrait of them that will stand up and is entertaining and is out there. You know, I think particularly political figures, you know, people or you know, people like Courtney Love, for example, you know, who did everything possible to stop me making a film. They define themselves, I guess, by what they do to try and stop you making a film, or the pressure they put on other people. And so you try and include all that information in the film. So it's a kind of different way of storytelling, but it entertains you while you're making the film, and I think it's an accurate portrait of them at the end of it.
How do you finance a film about, for instance, you made a film about Margaret Thatcher. When you go to the commissioning editor, say, I'm going to make a film about Margaret Thatcher, but she won't
participate. Well, it was very difficult at the beginning. People would say, well, okay, let me know when she's going to be in it. But for example, I think the first clip we're going to show you was a film we did in South Africa about someone called Eugene Terreblanche. And he was somebody who didn't want to be in the film at all. And Channel 4 had commissioned a film. They'd actually commissioned a different film altogether. They had commissioned me to go to South Africa and make a film about these Christian encounter groups, which were occurring at the time, where they would get black and white people together and kind of talk about differences. But it really wasn't a film that was going to work. I realized that it was kind of a non-starter, and it was very limited, the interaction. And I should go back one step and say that the deal I had with Channel 4 too was that it was a kind of lowish budget, and I was going to have the back end of the film, but I was going to put all the money for my salary, and I'd done a deal with the crew. Their money was going into the film too, so that if we needed to film for considerably longer than was in the budget, we would do so. So I was particularly determined to make a film that I could actually sell at the end of the day, otherwise we'd all be bankrupt. So I decided instead to try and do this film about the AWB, which was like the Nazi party in South Africa. And I convinced Channel 4 that this was a better film, and we went down to this place called Ventersdorp, completely sort of off the bat, and just started filming. And kind of, the film is really a record of our time down there, and it was also a kind of very well, for me, a revealing portrait of this guy Eugene Terreblanche. It was kind of like, I suppose, Germany in the 30s, where there were a lot of people who you would normally dismiss out of hand as being, if you read about them in a book, of being bad people, fascists, you know. But when you actually got to know them, you realize that these were people who were just caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, who weren't bad people, but this was how they'd ended up. It was kind of what they were. It was, I suppose, they felt their only defense or their only moment in time. And so I wanted to make a complex portrait about that. And I also didn't want to give them a platform, a political platform that I completely disagree with. And the clip you're going to see is an interview I did with the leader. He was called the leader, Eugene Terreblanche, who was murdered a couple of years ago by a couple of black workers, who was a big bully of a man who ruled this town, Ventersdorp, and there was a kind of curfew in the town, and if a black person was caught in the town of Ventersdorp after 8 o'clock, they would be beaten up by Eugene Terreblanche's troops. He had a kind of private army in this place. So in the interview, I wanted to try and reveal what kind of man he was, that he was a kind of a bully and a thug, and I didn't want him to just have a sort of political platform to come out with all his stuff. And, you know, South African journalists tended to go down and interview him in a day and then go back to Johannesburg. And he was given a kind of respect that I didn't think he deserved. So I tried to think of a way of upsetting him enough that he would reveal his true self in the interview. So we'll look at this clip, and then we can.
The film is called "The Leader, the Driver, and the Driver's Wife," and he is kind of the climax, you can say, in a way, of the film, when we actually meet the leader. And you have the interview. The whole film is about how you are trying to get this interview, and while you are waiting for this, you are portraying especially the wife of the driver, which is a very lovable woman, even though she's
got a cat called Kaffa Cat. But yes,
let's roll the clip.
Okay.
How rude of you to be late.
We actually, we decided this was the way to. He was such a vain man, and who had such a violent temper. I think you get a sense of a bit of his temper there, and he would just sort of. I think he drank so much, and he was, you know, his wife would go around the town with a black eye, and there was just this sort of underlying violence in the man. And I thought, you know, if we are 5 or 10 minutes late, that would be enough to set him off. And it had been a task just to get the interview. So we did actually sit in a tea shop, and we were like nervously going, what you say, how far can we push this, you know? And, you know, in the end, the producer, Rita Ord, said, I really think we better go there now, because we'll get run out of town otherwise as well. So, you know, and that was what happened. And I think you get a sense of the man. I think you get a sense of his politics. So that was just a sort of an experiment to push somebody, I guess. I mean, I guess it was manipulative, but I felt that it was a closer and more truthful version of who he was than sitting down and doing a straightforward interview.
Is this a political film? Do you consider yourself a political filmmaker?
Well, I think it is. It's inherently political. That situation was very, very political. It was about the sort of whites' last stand, I guess, before the ANC took power. But I also, I mean, we talked about this earlier. I would say that you make a very political decision when you choose a particular subject to make a film about. You know, it's like you evaluate something and say, well, is this subject really worth making? And I think part of that equation, for me anyway, is always, how does this resonate in a political way? What does this mean in its bigger sense? Are the characters that I'm choosing as characters in the film, do they have a bigger resonance than who they just are? Do they speak for a lot of other people? Do they embody some political statement? And but then I think once you've made that decision, I'm not saying this is the way to do it, but for me personally, I like films that then reveal the characters with all their contradictions, and it's not manipulative to the extent that you're actually so keen to make a point that you don't allow the real person to come through. And I think with this film, the driver, who you saw a very little bit of at the beginning there, JP, was actually he was a really lovely man in many ways, but he was also a complete fascist, you know, but he was very kind to his black servants, he was very kind to his animals, he was not a mean man, and I think if he had grown up in a different time and a different place, he would have been entirely different. And I wanted to try and reveal those contradictions in him. I thought that that was much more interesting than anything else. And, you know, his wife was very sweet too, and their relationship was interesting. And so I'm more interested in documentaries that then really allow you to see the characters. I just think it's a more interesting film than making something that's very didactic.
Mm. So this film was in a way coincidental, because you were actually on your way to make another film, and then you dropped that and decided to make this film.
Right.
Has it been like this all the time, that it's coincidental, or how do you find? I mean, how do you, when you go look for new subjects, what do you look for? How do you you know, spot a good story or good characters?
Well, I think, yeah, it's very much who those particular people are. I mean, on another film, I did a film about women being trained in the American Army, and we started filming at one base in Fort Dix, and the characters just weren't great. But I remembered this other base we'd been to in Georgia, where there was an amazing drill sergeant, and this black recruit called Joanne Johnson, who this particular staff sergeant hated so much, completely irrationally, because she had this enormous smile. And it didn't matter what, we just happened to, when we were doing research, we just watched the two of them together for like literally 5 minutes. And he couldn't ever get the smile off her face. And it drove him absolutely crazy. And that image kept coming back to me. And I was doing the film with Joan Churchill, and we just, you know, after filming in Fort Dix for 3 days, we thought, we really miss Joanne Johnson and Sergeant Abink, so we drove back to Georgia and made the film there. So I think it's very much, you just meet certain characters, and you know they're going to lead you through. I tend not to do very much research at all, because I think the research really should be in the film. And I think often your initial encounters with people are the strongest ones. People are like animals. They kind of sniff each other out, particularly in the beginning of your encounters. So I think you want to try and have those on film. So I tend to get a researcher to do all the initial contacts, and I will tend to go in filming. So you can't do that much work, but I think once you've started, sometimes you might move location, or you might concentrate on particular characters. You choose subjects, obviously they're multi-layered, so if one thing, that, you know, like for example, I'm going to show you something from Kurt and Courtney, but originally I was going to do much more of a straightforward music film about Kurt Cobain. And there are all these crazy old punk bands and other bands from the Seattle area that are now kind of completely out of work, and they've kind of reinvented themselves in weird ways. One lot were, I think they were called Napalm Beach. They were breeding rats in the house and so on. And I thought they would make an amazing film unto themselves. They were all friends of Kurt Cobain's and had all grown up. So I started making that film. And then Courtney got so upset that we were making the film without her permission that she kept closing us down, so we couldn't get music rights for things. And the film kept changing. But it was also a subject that was so multi-layered that it didn't really matter, because, you know, there were all the conspiracy theories about his death. There was, and frankly, I was putting all the stuff about her closing us down into the film as well. Anyway, I was filming all that. And I think you just choose subjects that have the scope to be bigger statements than what they are. And one of the most interesting things I think that happened on the Kurt and Courtney film, for example, was when we started out, we had lots of money. You know, we had the BBC, and then we had Time Warner were coming in, and then Viacom and MTV were investing as well. And then when things started going wrong with Courtney, they were so worried that they weren't going to get the next Courtney Love album, or maybe they would lose Nirvana. They all dropped out, so we lost all the American side of the financing. which I thought was really interesting. I mean, it was very annoying too, because I really didn't have enough money at the end of the week often to pay the crew. But I thought this is very revealing, you know, that in America it's easy to make films about blue-collar crime or people who aren't well known or people who don't have any money. But when you start tapping into people who represent real estate in terms of what they can produce for those entities, people just don't want to invest in your film. And I felt that was all part of the film. And so it became much more of a film about freedom of speech and so on, which was a much more interesting film, frankly, than the one I'd originally set out to make about Kurt Cobain and his musical influences and stuff.
So in a way, that was also a coincidence that she would fight so much for you not to make the film, that would be the film. Yeah, that it just made the film stronger and stronger.
But obviously, in the BBC, I was working with Nick Fraser at the BBC, and I think he felt the heat too, because she was contacting the BBC and threatening to sue them, although we hadn't even cut anything. But he was experienced enough and as a commissioning editor to see what the significance was and to be fascinated by it. And I think the trouble is you run into problems when you've got a commissioning editor who's far from fascinated by it. They're terrified by it. And they're like, this is a mistake, you've got to finish. So obviously the more films I made like this, the more people are prepared to take risks. But I think a lot depends on the attitude of the commissioning editors and how supportive they are and whether they get what you're trying to do,
Let's roll the clip, huh?
That's right.
Yeah. The Courtney clip.
Yeah, what we didn't explain, we didn't really set that up, unfortunately, but it was, there were so many bonkers characters in this leading up to the ACLU thing, and there were these two stalkerazzi characters, Alan Jack, one of whom who was doing that terrible filming there, who started working with me on the film, which we hadn't set up in the clip. And the ACLU thing was very much an attempt to make a public statement, I guess, about how difficult it was to make this film in terms of the freedom of speech and all the American backers dropping out of the film. So that was kind of the summation of how that happened, and the only way I could think of actually doing that.
It's funny because when you also in this clip and in many others of when you meet people in your films, you're not really afraid to go into. I mean, you're not trying to please them in any way. You're really asking them questions which are very often very annoying for them.
Oh, with Courtney's father.
Yeah, but
yeah. Well, no. It's true. I mean, I think that was probably the third interview I'd done with him too. And what I think is quite interesting is that when you interview somebody maybe the first time, that it's a pretty open-ended interview and you just try and get information. And then as you learn more about them in the course of making the film, that you then come back and re-interview them maybe with more specific questions 2 or 3 times. And I think that was maybe the last interview I did with Courtney's father. And by then, I had a lot of other information about what kind of father he was and about their relationship. And I was more confrontational with him there. Also, I think Hank clearly loved the rough and tumble of it all. He was that sort of guy. And I think he was a big clue to the way Courtney is, too. I think they're quite similar.
But it was, of course, a strategy with the Nazi leader, but is it like a general strategy for you to piss people off?
I hope not. No, because I often like a lot of people, actually. But I think interviews can be quite interesting if they're slightly confrontational, because I think people tend to reveal more about themselves that way. I think it's interesting at the beginning to see how they define themselves, but then it becomes more interesting maybe how you're defining them, and so it becomes more of a challenging conversation than just an interview. But I think it certainly, I think, limits the number of subjects I get to these days, which I think is a pity.
How do you mean?
Well, I think, not everybody wants to be filmed by me. So, I think that's a limit. Well, it's a bit late in my career to, I can't undo all the work I've done.
But it also haven't stopped you in the past, haven't it?
No. But I think it's, I'm sure, for example, Sarah Palin and various other political figures that I've wanted to interview, I was not at the top of their list of interviewees, that they wanted to see. So that, you have to go to a lot of subterfuge sometimes. You have to set up other companies and get other people to do the interviews and so on. It has become more difficult.
But it has become a strategy for you, hasn't it? To make these to make films about people who doesn't want to be in the film.
Well, I think.
I mean, Sarah Palin, for instance, is a good example.
Well, I thought. I mean, she just doesn't want to be. The only people she'd do interviews with was with Fox, who she was an employee of. So I think she was terrified of anybody who might interview her. It wasn't just me, actually, but. Yes, I think, well, obviously a lot of politicians, I think, are very reluctant to be interviewed, and they have a list of people that they will be interviewed by, and that's it. Otherwise, they feel that they're risking more than they might gain from. And you have to try and find ways around that. But yes, it is a limitation, I think.
How about the legal issues? Have you had a lot of lawsuits in your career?
I've had a few, but on the whole, I've been pretty careful. I've obviously had good lawyers, and I've always been careful to not overstep a mark, I think. I mean, in point of fact, the most difficult thing is copyright issues. It's not really slander and libel, and particularly in America, if you're a public figure, I think it's very hard to sue. Obviously, you're not going to come up with completely inaccurate information, but if you're a public figure in the US, there's a large amount of public accountability, so you're considered to be a public figure and to be accountable in a public way. So I think it's quite difficult to prove, libel, for example. But on copyright infringement, music, that kind of thing, it's very cut and dried, and that's where you have to be much more careful.
And I know that the national broadcaster of Denmark has a long, paper saying all about these ethics that you don't want to talk about. But I know that even in the BBC
you make me feel like I've got something to hide. No, I don't.
The BBC has even longer kind of paper describing their ethics. How did you get away with making, for instance, this trespassing or this gate crashing at the ACLU? That wasn't a problem?
I have no problem saying the American Council of Civil Liberties has some explaining to do when they have their special guest is somebody who's, tried to actually knock someone out with an Oscar, was actually crawling around under the table trying to slug, and pulled another journalist across the floor with their hair. I mean, it's like, what are you talking about? So I think there's certain things that are just cause, But if you want to talk about ethics, I think one of the confusing things that's happened, which is, in the UK after the Leveson inquiry, and after the sort of Murdoch disaster with the phone tapping and everything, everyone's very frightened. And part of the problem with the Leveson is it hasn't really come out with any specific recommendations. which is even worse in a way because everybody's frightened. And it's not just the press, it's also prison officers, policemen, public officials. They're all terrified to talk to the press. So I think it's something that obviously needs to be looked at and attended to, because I think a lot of information that the public should be getting in a sort of democratic system is not coming through. Particularly, in England, people are very worried about talking and doing things. So I think we're going through a very difficult period at the moment, and there's a kind of overreaction to some of the awful things that were done, the phone tapping and all the rest of it, which is understandable, but it needs to be redressed, I think.
All right. During the latest years, you have been making also feature films. Why did you make that change in your career?
I was very interested in the extension of using real people to act themselves. And, I loved, for example, that film that Michael Winterbottom did. I think it was called In This World, about two kids going across Europe with real people. And the first film I did was about the Morecambe Bay, the cockle pickers tragedy, and I used a lot of illegal Chinese immigrants to basically act themselves. And then I did an Iraq war film called Battle for Haditha, in which I used ex-US Marines, most of whom had been in Iraq. I put them in a barracks in Jordan, but most of them thought that they were still in Iraq. They couldn't really tell the difference. And I used a lot of Iraqi refugees who had come into Jordan, and we recreated this particular incident. And it was amazing how, people revert very much to type, and I think it was just a very powerful way of making a film, and it was very interesting to do. So it was kind of an extension of working with real people, but also having a stronger narrative in it.
What is the difference between, for you, or is there any difference of making documentary and making feature films?
Well, I think the thing I love about documentary is, as with you, I mean, you work just by yourself. I tend to work with two other people. And it's very much, I always do all the research as I go along, and I think you learn things, and you're in an incredibly privileged position to meet people that you would never normally meet, and have friendships and experiences that you wouldn't have any other way, which is just amazing. And hopefully bring back something that is worthwhile for people to see who aren't going to have that experience themselves. And features obviously working a very different way, because you're having to structure it ahead of time. You're having to do all the research ahead of time, and then you're trying to make it as real as possible when you do it later, and you're working with many more people and so on. It's just a different way of organizing things. It's a different set of challenges, really.
And luckily for us, documentary freaks, you are still working on documentary. And you have brought a treat, I think at least for us today, of a film that you are producing right now. Yeah.
It's a portrait very much of South Central Los Angeles, which is an area of Los Angeles which has been kind of left behind by the rest of the city. It's an area of very high unemployment. There used to be aircraft factories and a lot of industry there, but that was all outsourced, and then crack cocaine came in the 80s, and the area has never recovered. And in the chaos of this area, which was so devastated, a number of serial killers started operating, and up to 5, I think, were operating at the same time. And one of them was able to kill for 30 years before he was caught. And the film looks which I haven't cut yet, actually. These are just rushes. The film looks very much at the sort of historical situation of South Central, and also how it was possible for this person to be doing what he was doing for so long. And in fact, the community had to form, it was called Black Coalition Against Serial Killers, where a group of women, lawyers, journalists came together and they formed this coalition to try and put pressure on the LAPD and the Sheriff's Department to do something about this. The LAPD had known since 1988 that there was a serial killer on the streets of South Central, and that he'd killed at least 10 people. They had a gun. They knew that the same gun had killed 10 women. But this information wasn't released to the public until 2006, and that was only because it was leaked through the LA Weekly. And then the police had to sort of try and come clean. So it's very much a look, and it's also a portrait of the guy, Lonnie Franklin, who has been arrested for it. So it's a complicated story, and anyway, these are some scattered bits of rushes, which probably don't make a lot of sense. But
and how do you come across this story? How do you decide to make this film?
I think I met with one of the journalists who had been very active on this case, and we actually met to talk about a different story altogether. And she mentioned this case, which has actually received very little publicity because it's a black-on-black crime, and it's not good copy. So, but I started reading about it, and I just thought, this is an amazing story. And I thought part of what was amazing was the Black Coalition and these people who were doing it, and there was this incredible spirit in this community of people who wanted to change things and were determined to survive and were, just incredible people. So it wasn't just a portrait of a serial killer, which I think would have been not so what I wouldn't have wanted to do.
So it seems like it's the same story every time. So if you should give advice to young filmmakers, it would be go out and make some bad film, and then when a better one comes along, then go for that one.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, let's roll the last clip. So we will be looking forward for that film. I think we have just a few minutes left, so if there's any questions. Come on, don't be shy. All right then. Nobody wants to ask anything? It's lunchtime. People are... Okay, so we will just end here. Thank you very much for coming.